Welcome to the next panel, Limits to Growth, Resource Crisis and Shifting Ideas of Global and Planetary Boundaries. My name is Nina Mackert. I'm a research fellow in the Leipzig Lab Global Health, and I have organized this panel together with Antje Dietze from the Leipzig Center for the Study of France and the Francophonie. And we have also cooperated with the Centre Marc Bloch Berlin for this panel, especially with the research unit Environment, Climate and Energy. Thanks to all of you, all of our cooperation partners, so to say. And special thanks to our distinguished panelists who have agreed on very short notice to contribute to this panel to our question of resource crises and their connections to understandings of global orders and planetary boundaries. Many of the crisis narratives and diagnoses that engage us today revolve around resources, around resource use and consumption, because humans have been busy turning the planet into a set of resources, understanding it as resources for human thriving. So anxieties about resource scarcity and resource depletion have been a recurring element in the making of modernity, and they have often been accompanied by or fueled epistemic ruptures, shifts in the understandings of worldviews, of global orders, struggles over knowledge and beliefs that had been taken for granted before. And today we want to take a closer look at some of these entanglements of such diagnoses and of shifting ideas of modern orders, in particular of capitalist orders, of understandings of the past and future, and of ideas of nature and the environment. We have five distinguished panelists for today, whose talks we will hear in a minute. Just a few words on procedure. We have agreed to hear all of the talks one after another because they speak to each other very well. And to have just a little time for comprehension question after each talk, but then have a larger discussion at the end of this panel after the comment by Daniela Russ. So please take your larger questions for the discussion. I will very briefly introduce the speakers when it is their turn. Although I think that those of you interested in the history of the Anthropocene will know all of them. But it's my great pleasure to start with the first two speakers, Frederick Alberton Johnson and Carl Wennerlind. Frederick Alberton Johnson is Associate Professor of British History, Conceptual and Historical Studies of Science at the University of Chicago. And he's an ultra-prolific scholar on the history of the environment, science, and political economy. And he places a particular focus on resource use, scarcity, and abundance. He has published numerous articles and books, and please do check out his publication list. I will only mention 3 of them, and my apologies for that. The first one is the book called Enlightenment's Frontier, The Scottish Highlands and the Origins of Environmentalism, that came out in 2013 with Yale University Press. Then he has co-edited a book, Scarcity in the Modern World, History, Politics, Society, and Sustainability, 1800 to 2075, with Bloomsbury Press in 2019. And thirdly, the brand new book, I think it was just published just 2 days ago, Scarcity, Economy and Nature in the Age of Capitalism, published with Harvard University Press. And he co-authored this book with, what a coincidence, Carl Wennerlind, who will also be giving this first talk. Carl is a professor of history at Barnard College and a historian of early modern Europe with a focus on intellectual history and political economy. And it's the history of ideas on money, credit, and the relationship between economy and nature, and of concepts of modernization that are of special interest to him. Carl has published extensively on these issues as well. Let me mention only a few next to the book on scarcity and capitalist political economy. I want to mention the book A Philosopher's Economist, Hume and the Rise of Capitalism, published with University of Chicago Press in 2020. He co-authored this book with Margaret Chabas. And I want to mention the recent article, Atlantis Restored, Natural Knowledge and Political Economy in Early Modern Sweden, published in the American Historical Review in 2022. And I believe this article is part of his current research project. So we have been really delighted that Frederick and Carl have agreed to speak today on the topic of planetary scarcity and the end of neoclassical economics. Thank you so much for joining us.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the introductions. Thank you, everyone who's in the room, everyone who's on Zoom. We're absolutely delighted to be here. And as was just mentioned, this book just came out this week. So we are delighted that it's out for the world to see it, work with it, critique it, engage with it. So hopefully we can give you a little bit of an overview of what this book is about, at least the last few chapters. So, our book is about scarcity, but scarcity is inherently connected to the idea of growth. And it's fair to say that economic growth has done amazing things for humanity in the last few hundred years. Even Marx famously acknowledged that capitalism has accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals, if you can switch, Frederick. And this was in 1848. And imagine what he would have said had he been in New York City or Shanghai in 2023. He would have seen the actual effects of the Great Acceleration. Now, continuous exponential economic growth is, of course, an historical oddity. So for 99.9993% of the time that Homo sapiens has roamed the earth, there's been nothing even remotely resembling exponential economic growth. So this is a real historical aberration. Now, where does this come from? There are, of course, millions of different explanations, but what we focus on in this book is the mindset or worldview or zeitgeist within which it's possible to think about infinite economic growth and infinite economic improvement. And we make the argument that at the moment, this worldview is very much structured by modern economic thinking. So economists tell us that economic growth can continue in perpetuity, that resource use should always be maximized to promote consumer welfare, and that science will always come up with substitutes if resources start running low. So this has led, for example, to proclamations such as this by Robert Solow, who says the world can in effect get along without natural resources, so exhaustion is just an event, not a catastrophe. So progress is eternal and the future will be better than today. Economic growth provides the answer to almost all our challenges, whether economic, social, and political. So at the root of this concept of growth is the neoclassical notion of scarcity. So the first thing that you learn when you walk into an Econ 101 class is that everything in the world is scarce. And that's, of course, on one level, a truism, because time is limited, and so is the planet. But that's not the way that economists conceive of this. They have a more specific definition. So they make the argument that everything in the world is scarce because humans have insatiable desires. So we always want more, we're never content. As Karl Menger said in the 1870s, one may live in a palace, consume the choicest foods, and dress in the most costly garments. Another may find his resting place in the dark corner of a miserable hut, feed on leftovers, and cover himself with rags. But both of them face scarcity. Both of them are forced to make trade-off. So kind of on the demand side of the equation, humanity always wants more. And then in terms of how neoclassical economists think about nature, nature is always fungible. In fact, everything in the world is fungible because you can turn, in an alchemical way, anything into anything else through the market. And then also, there's this idea of infinite substitutability, that whenever we run out of something, science will always come up with a solution. So if we are faced with the economist version of perennial scarcity, it makes sense, it's logical to want to use our resources as efficiently as possible to maximize the use of our resources. And also, of course, to develop science and technology to maximize the production of material wealth, because ultimately all we want to do is to promote as much consumer well-being as possible. The problem with this worldview is that it has been too successful in achieving its ends. So the Great Acceleration has given rise to a climate crisis, a biodiversity crisis, a resource exhaustion crisis, and an oceanic acidification crisis. We're running low on resources. We are also running low on sinks. And Freddie's going to talk more about that later. So we're in a new era. We're in an era of planetary scarcity where we can no longer use economic growth as the solution because economic growth is the problem. Now, some people suggest that we just need to be more patient, that we just need to allow genetic engineering, nanotechnology, AI, geoengineering, and so forth to work itself out. And by doing so, we can adjust that which we have caused. So there's still some people who believe that we are in control of nature, whereas Frederick and I are arguing that we're only partially in control of nature, and there are all these unintended consequences that we don't know how to deal with, and that therefore the safest way to proceed into the future is to really reconceive of the way in which we fundamentally understand the relationship between the economy and nature. So what we do in this book is that we give you an example of different ways whereby people in the past have thought about this relationship. And we go back to the 1500s and we lay out a kind of smorgasbord of different approaches. And we do this in order to provide a list or a list of different conceptualizations that might inspire people and specifically younger social scientists as they're approaching these problems. We're not suggesting that any of these approaches can just be lifted from the past and applied to today, but as we're trying to kind of historicize the modern notion of scarcity, which has been just profoundly normalized and naturalized, we believe that it's useful to give a sense of alternative approaches from the past. So I'm not going to talk because we don't have time to talk about the lead up to neoclassical economics. The neoclassical economics emerges into the world around 1850 or so. More and more contributions to it starts happening in the 1870s. And by 1890s, it's becoming relatively dominant, although it's not really dominant in the US until the post-war era, and one can argue slightly later in Europe and other places of the world. But the people who are instrumental in forging neoclassical economics is, of course, Jevons, Marshall, Walras, and Menger. So what they argued is that people have fairly narrow utility functions. Firms are all trying to maximize profits. Everyone is trying to get the maximum amount at all times, and that this is forging this kind of cauldron or context of incessant desires for more and more. What's interesting, and we can talk more about the neoclassical approach to this later on. What's interesting about there are many different interesting aspects. One of them is that that neoclassical economics and the focus on the marginal and the infinitesimal appears at a moment for the first time you have a truly cornucopian economy. Energy use has enabled, and technology has enabled, labor formation and management techniques has enabled mass production for the first time. So one would imagine that you'd try to theorize abundance and the growth of the entire system, but the economists instead focused in on the individual choices of firms and individuals. Another interesting aspect in terms of neoclassical economics is that even some of its own practitioners thought that scarcity was something that you could overcome. Marshall, for example, talked about how education of the working classes and economic chivalry of the business classes could lead to an easing of the condition in which everyone constantly wants more. So he believed that if workers were more educated, they would be able to produce more, their wages would increase, so that the dearth conditions or the economic pressure that they were under could be alleviated. And if the businessman became more chivalrous, they wouldn't be striving for more and more money and more profits and more wealth all the time, so that people could live in a world where there was an easier relationship to their material conditions. Keynes very famously wrote in the 1930s that in about 100 years, the question of scarcity would have been resolved. Sure, there were some people who'd still pursued accumulation and conspicuous consumption, but those should be marginalized and should be basically assigned to mental health experts. And this is not something that ordinary humanity would do if the basic question of scarcity had been resolved, i.e. that everyone had enough for their sustenance, their food, their shelter, and their clothing. So just to round up my version of the talk here, even though there are people pushing back against the way that neoclassical economists conceived of scarcity, they challenged the insatiability notion. People have challenged the infinite substitutability notion. The paradigm became stronger and stronger in the latter part of the 20th century. So students who are coming through economics courses, our future policymakers, businessmen, entrepreneurs, journalists, and pundits are all taking for granted that the fundamental role of the economy is to maximize exploitation of resources and maximize economic growth. These are the cornerstones of capitalism, cornerstones of modernity. And this has, of course, been extraordinarily successful in terms of promoting expansion, improvement, and growth, at least in certain parts of the world. The problem, of course, is that deeply embedded in this success is a potential disaster. And I hand it over to you, Fredrik.
Great. So as we just heard, the origin of the modern worldview of cornucopian growth and insatiable desires lies in the second industrial revolution in the late 19th century. But I will focus here in the second half of my talk on the moment we're in currently, what John McNeill, the environmental historian, calls the Great Acceleration. And you see in the slide a graph of the Great Acceleration. This is the updated one from 2015, which includes disaggregated trends, not just in OECD, but also BRICS and the rest. So we get a better sense of the economic inequalities and also convergence in the post-war moment. After World War II, the advanced economies of the world entered a period of unprecedented economic growth, powered by new technology, cheap energy, and mass consumption. Politicians and economists greeted the Great Acceleration with open arms. For most members of the economics profession, this sustained growth vindicated the basic optimism of the discipline about the truth and universality of the idea of neoclassical scarcity. Innovation, substitution, and growing efficiency seemed capable of averting every conceivable threat of depletion and pollution. The new aggregate measure of gross domestic product made abstract growth easy to fathom and celebrate. And in liberal democracies across the West, the holy grail of sustained growth became the foundation of electoral politics. And obviously, we also see a similar embrace of cornucopianism in the Soviet bloc and elsewhere around the world. But at the same time, human impacts on the environment escalated. The scientific notion of the Great Acceleration captures systemic and interrelated impacts of economic development on the biosphere, beginning around 1950 and continuing to the present. I note in passing that this framework of the Great Acceleration complements and supplements a twin concept of planetary boundaries put forward in 2009 by environmental scientists Johan Rockström and Will Steffen. And above all, the Great Acceleration in its environmental guise is, of course, embodied in a dizzying rise in greenhouse gases. Atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide has surpassed the Holocene pattern, from a global mean of 311 parts per million in the atmosphere in 1950 to around 417 in the previous year. It's worth noting that while emissions came mostly from the OECD countries during the early phase of the Great Acceleration, after 1980, China, India, and other developing economies, the BRICS countries, have contributed increasing shares. The political discovery of anthropogenic climate change pushed the discourse of natural limits and environmental degradation in a new direction. From the age of Malthus onward, so from around 1798 onward, pessimists had worried about the physical limits to growth imposed by the finite supply of land and non-renewable mineral stock. Think of Jevons' coal question here. This is the condition and the idea of scarcity we call Malthusian scarcity. But with global warming and the threat to biodiversity, the conception of scarcity shifted from a problem of finite stock to a scarcity of sinks. Simply put, there's too much coal, petroleum, and natural gas to consume in relation to the Earth system's capacity to absorb the waste products, the emissions of fossil fuel. And another corollary here is that the ancient symbol of infinite space, the boundless ocean and endless atmosphere, have turned out to be all too finite. In the book, Carl and I describe an emerging awareness of the problem of planetary scarcity already in the 50s and 60s with figures like Rachel Carson and Kenneth Boulding. But we also emphasize that it's really in the 80s, in the 1980s, with Jim Hansen's testimony to Congress, for example, and the founding of the IPCC, that we get a political awareness that planetary sinks exist and that they're already in the process of filling up. In his 2016 essay, The Great Derangement, the Indian novelist and social critic Amitav Ghosh argues that the rise of the industrial economies in the global south exposes a cruel truth about fossil fuel development. By driving up worldwide demand for energy and resources, while at the same time increasing waste and pollution in the system, fossil globalization, fossil capitalism is pushing the planet ever closer to calamitous degradation and tipping points. Ghosh's paradox captures an essential characteristic of the relation between neoclassical scarcity and planetary scarcity. The more the developing nations seek to emulate the fossil path, the greater the disruption of the carbon cycle. The original promise of neoclassical economics cannot be universalized without deepening danger to the biosphere. So in effect, we get a clash of two worldviews, where neoclassical scarcity sees history as a confluence or an engine of ever-expanding desires and technological progress. Planetary scarcity reveals the limits of ingenuity, the force of unintended consequences, and the fragility of all earthly things. Great. All right, so this is the point in our book where we introduce a rather strange historical protagonist. Most of the book is about important thinkers, men and women, sometimes subalterns, sometimes, but many of them in the elite. But in the epilogue of the book, we introduce a new character. In the upper layers of Earth's oceans, single-cell organisms, collectively known as phytoplankton, thrive in great numbers, drifting along the currents. Although microscopic in size, phytoplankton add up to a biological force that shapes the conditions of life on the planet. Decomposing phytoplankton yield the crucial ingredient in shale and petroleum, of course. So they are, in fact, the source of the challenge we face. But as converters of solar energy, phytoplankton also shape the food chains in the ocean. And by transforming carbon dioxide and water into oxygen and carbohydrates through photosynthesis, phytoplankton offer a sink for human pollution, while at the same time making the atmosphere breathable to other life forms. Nearly 40% of carbon dioxide emissions from humans have been taken up by the ocean. Even though they comprise less than 1% of the biomass on the planet, phytoplankton are as important to the Earth system and the carbon cycle as terrestrial sinks, if not more so. Now, the science of phytoplankton is a belated achievement. Only recently have scientists begun to grasp the significance of these organisms in the Earth system. For millennia, humans have ignored the life of the oceans, imagining that the sea was infinite and impervious to human influence. Now we're beginning to appreciate just how vulnerable the ocean actually is. The capitalist economy has brought about rapid and massive changes that threaten to overwhelm the health of the oceans. The science of phytoplankton therefore resembles, in this regard, the discovery of anthropogenic climate change. Both reveal critical material boundaries for human flourishing. Both suggest how little we know about the natural world and how dangerous the current worldview of neoclassical economics has been for the stable functioning of the Earth system. So we suggest in our book that rather than to press ahead with further growth and exploitation, a better strategy might be to repair the damage done, to back off, to preserve marine ecosystems from further disturbances. We call this possibility the age of repair. So I'll finish by just saying a few words about what we mean, what that might entail. Slowing down the great acceleration, maybe even making it come to a stop, will require immense effort and creativity in cultural and technological terms. This is the paradox. In order to slow down, we have to take a leap. The complex challenge of planetary scarcity rules out a strategy focused only on restraint and withdrawal. Humanity faces threats so dangerous that extensive technological intervention and cultural change may be necessary. To back off, we first need to repair what has been damaged. This is not the right moment for technophobia or apocalyptic pessimism. But perhaps what we could do is to banish older forms of mechanistic and dualistic cornucopianism from our culture and ideology and replace it with something different, universal flourishing within planetary constraints. And as you see here, this is the famous, really iconic image now of life within planetary boundaries. Now, we are not offering any concrete solutions in our book, but we do imagine a series of possible futures in which this new regime of repair might be viable. Of course, decarbonization is at the center of it, possibly carbon sequestration of different kinds, including the construction of artificial sinks. But carbon removal might also be imagined in terms of reparations and debt payment from the affluent countries. We might also imagine repair in terms of the regeneration of natural sinks, a planet-wide project of rewilding, perhaps, to make room for functional and genetic biodiversity. No doubt political priorities will determine the shape of things to come. As Troy Vitesse and Drew Pendergast ask in their book, Half-Earth Socialism, should a vegan diet become a mandatory global priority to save land? All of these possibilities should be under discussion at this point. What we want to emphasize is that the ethos of repair will require a profound psychological shift across the planet. Cornucopian ideology has usurped the universal aspiration of equality, freedom, and creativity. Any viable alternative to the present regime needs to come to terms with the human desire for self-determination and channel it in new directions. Repair does not rule out an element of dynamism. Sustainable economies can still foster individual and collective forms of creativity, pleasure, and play, channeled through science and art, as well as everyday living. But whatever freedom we have in the great deceleration, that human freedom and desire will have to be bounded by the new condition of planetary scarcity. Thank you so much.
Our next speaker, Jean-Baptiste Fresson. He is a research fellow at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique in Paris, several languages here, and member of the Centre de Recherche Historique. He is a historian of science, technology, and the environment, and particularly interested in the history of the Anthropocene and of climate knowledge. Among his many books and articles are the 2020 book Les Révoltes du Ciel, une histoire de changement climatique, 15e au 20e siècle, which came out with Le Seuil in Paris 2020 and was co-authored with Fabien Locher. And as I just heard, there will be an English edition in 2024. He has also co-written the 2017 book, The Shock of the Anthropocene, The Earth, History, and Us, co-authored with Christophe Bonneuil. And I also want to mention a recent article because that one resonates very much with the talk he's giving today. And that's the text, La transition énergétique de l'utopie atomique au déni climatique aux États-Unis. That was published in 2022 in the Revue d'Histoire moderne et contemporaine. His talk today is entitled, We Have to Think the Climate as a Resource, Atomic Malthusians and the Framing of the Climate Problem. Thank you very much, Jean-Baptiste, for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone, for having me. So before I start to really on my topic of today, I'd like to explain, give a few pointers of a more general project, which is a book which is going to be published in 24. It's a reflection on the notion of energy transition. When you think about it, it's an extremely weird notion. It has been taken up by historians because historians have just copied the vocabulary of the technocrats. But in fact, it shouldn't be an in-house notion for historians because, as you probably all know, there's never been at a global level anything such as an energy transition. And when you use the word energy transition to describe many different processes, most of the time you simplify radically what is happening on the ground. I just give you one example, which I think is fairly clear and striking. This is a very famous graph taken from Anthony Wrigley, a book on the Industrial Revolution. And it seems to be a good example of an energy transition. On dark gray, you've got the firewood, which disappears and petered out around 1850. And in light gray, you've got a sudden expansion of coal. So there is a kind of energy transition from wood to coal. But of course, this is just simply false for one simple reason. Just to extract the coal that Britain used in the 20th century, Britain used much more wood than it did in the 18th century. So, for instance, the pit props in 1900, they represent like 4.5 million cubic meters of wood every year to sustain the galleries, the roof of the mining galleries. It's more than the wood that was burnt in the mid-18th century. So and this is, of course, since it is construction timber, Britain needs much larger forest in the 20th century than it did in the 18th century. So when you've got a whole bunch of historiography talking about the Industrial Revolution as an energy transition, or even worse, as an escape from an organic economy, you've got a radically wrong vision of what has happened in the past. So all the narrative of transition should be replaced by a different kind of narrative. It's a kind of symbiotic accumulation of materials and energy which has taken place in history. For a very long period of time, people knew that. Economists, geologists, foresters, engineers knew that there was no such thing as an energy transition. Sorry, there is work in my flat or in my building. This is one of the first graphs representing the evolution of the energy mix of the world. It is produced by a US engineer from the Geological Survey of 1932. I mean, when the engineer comments upon this graph, where you've got obviously a decrease in the share of coal and an increase in the share of oil, he never talks about an energy transition because he knows that it is temporary. Of course, coal has diminished because of the economic crisis of 29, obviously, but also because there is an increase of energy efficiency in electricity production. But because electricity is so central to modern life and electricity is bound to be connected with coal, and coal is indispensable for cement and for glass and for all sorts of materials, coal remains the pillar of industrial civilization, that's the word that he uses. I jump 40 years later. This is a representation of the future of the energy mix of the US. It's produced in 1972 by a promoter of solar energy. So obviously solar energy is going to increase radically in the future. But the interesting thing is for this particular engineer, all energies are going to increase. I mean, there is no vision of energy as a system in substitution with a dynamic of substitution. This is really, it's not present at all in the reflection on energy for a very long period of time. And for this particular engineer, basically the future of energy is like the present. It's a bigger present, but it's not radically different. Okay, so really the idea of energy transition is not a central notion for a very long period of time in the reflection on the evolution of energy. It comes from a very particular set of individuals and scientists, and I call them the atomic Malthusians. What I meant by that is because they are atomic scientists, and for most of them actually work in one particular laboratory, which is the metallurgical laboratory of the University of Chicago, where Enrico Fermi, of course, invented the first atomic pile. Most of them were rather on the left. They were horrified by what they had done, of course, with the atomic bombing of Japan. But they explained that atomic energy was also the key for the survival of humanity. And why so? Because if you got atomic energy, you can do incredible stuff. And especially you can produce much more grains. Why? Because if you got atomic energy, you can desalinate the oceans and you can mass produce fertilizers. So you can grow grain on arid zone of the planet. This was really a project which was pushed forward in the 1960s. This is a graphic from an article of Alvin Weinberg, a very important atomic scientist who was also interested in the demographic questions. And it is in this particular group that the idea of energy transition emerged. The first time I found the phrase energy transition, it is in a chapter of a book by this scientist, extremely important, also from the metallurgical laboratory, a specialist in uranium, the chemistry of uranium and plutonium, Harrison Brown. Harrison Brown is a very important scientist, even for climate change. I can come back to that later. He's basically was the advisor of Killing, the famous scientist of the Killing curve. And for specific reason, the atomic scientists were key in the construction of new knowledge on climate change in the 1950s, as early as the 1950s. And Harrison Brown so phrases the word energy transition in a chapter of a book on demographic control. And for him, he got his inspiration from another transition, the demographic transition of Kingsley Davis from the 1950s. And for him, basically, if you got nuclear energy, you change the parameter of the demographic question because you can enlarge the carrying capacity of planet Earth. So really, atomic energy is seen as an escape from the Malthusian trap of overpopulation and the exhaustion of resources in general. One last key character in the group of atomic Malthusian is not an atomic scientist. It's Marion King Hubbard. that you all know of because of his theory of peak oil. Marion King Herbert is employed by the Shell, but starting from 1955 onwards, he works for the Atomic Energy Commission. And of course, for the Atomic Energy Commission, it's particularly interesting to have a geologist explaining that fossil fuels are going to run out. I mean, this is a very good argument to explain that the US government should finance generously the Atomic Energy Commission for its civilian program. And Marion King Herbert has really an important and not very well-known role, actually, as a lobbyist for the Atomic Energy Commission. He writes whole chapters of reports that are sent to John Fitzgerald Kennedy, for instance. So it's really a defense of nuclear energy. And all the idea of peak oil actually emerged because you've got this fantastic representation of the history of humanity. If you de-zoom the history of humanity over 10,000 years, indeed, fossil fuels are quite limited. The small little thing, the small little dark thing on the graph. And this idea of peak is because you contrast with the unlimited plateau of atomic energy, nuclear energy. So this group of scientists, they are the first to really think seriously about an energy transition because they think about the future of energy, a very long-term future. You know, very few people ask themselves the question of what will be the energy mix in 100, 200, 300, 500 years. It's not like the common question, except a few people, but it's quite rare. It's not what the oil geologists do most of the time. So it's really an argument in favor of atomic energy. And because atomic scientists and basically the promoters of atomic energy think the future on a very large timescale, they're also the first to really think about climate change. Because if you start thinking about what's happening if we burn all the fossil fuels, suddenly you've got strange things happening in the atmosphere, right? So this group of scientists were really crucial, I think, in the way of framing this idea of energy transition. There will be a transition for a very simple reason, because we're going to run out of fossil fuels. Another step in the promotion of this idea of energy transition is a US president, Jimmy Carter. In April 1977, he makes an important speech where it's really a kind of history course. He says, "My dear citizen, the US have known already two transitions, one from wood to coal, the second from coal to oil, and now because of the oil shock, we have to do a third transition." So it shows that this idea of energy transition has always been rooted in a kind of history of energy. It's really a way of connecting the past and the future, a very dubious way of connecting the past and the future, as I explained in the beginning. But what interests me is really the source of this wrong vision of history of energy. It came from this particular graph, which I think is extremely important for the history of energy transition. This is a graph representing the evolution of the US energy mix over a century. And of course, the trick is to put everything in relative share, right? Normally, you describe the evolution of the energy in the US with this kind of graph, where the idea of transition is not obvious, right? You rather see an addition or, yes, a stratification of energy sources. But the trick is, if you put everything in terms of share, then suddenly you've got a beautiful, harmonious representation of two beautiful transitions, right? But the interesting thing is the US administration of energy that created this graph, they got their inspiration, they plagiarized actually the work of this Italian scientist, Cesare Marchetti, who is really an important intellectual also for the history of energy transition and really shows the link between what I've told you for the moment and the issue of climate change. Cesare Marchetti is an atomic scientist, is the first promoter of the idea of hydrogen economy. You know, we all, with Jeremy Rifkin and the Green New Deal, and in France also, we have got a lot of talks about, you know, hydrogen as the future of the future energy carrier for a decarbonized economy. Is really the first one to put forward this argument. As soon as 1963, it is at the Euratom that he makes this point. For me, it is kind of obvious that if nuclear energy is limited to to electricity, it will never have such a big role. To really become important, atomic energy has to conquer the market of liquid fuels. It has to displace petroleum, right? And to do that, he plans to, in the future for him, there will be enormous nuclear plants in the middle of the oceans so that nobody would complain. You don't have the problem of the heat islands, the heat pollution of atomic plants, which was really a big issue in the 1960s. And you would produce hydrogen, liquid hydrogen, which would be sold all over the world with tankers. So this is kind of, future, the future that he envisions. It's a kind of Dr. Folamour future in a way, but it's very interesting because from 1974 onwards, he works at the IIASA, which is the International Institute for Applied System Analysis, a key research institution for the IPCC Group 3, for all the expertise on energy transition until nowadays. He works at the IIASA, and at the IIASA, he does something which is quite, not very common at that time. He starts to look at history to envision the future. For him, the future of energy can be read in the historical curves describing the energy, and he starts to collect historical data on energy for all over the world. And he tries to, he makes these graphs where he starts to map energy in terms of relative share. So this was really in this milieu, very particular milieu, that the idea of energy transition is really thought upon. Really in a new way, in a quantitative way. The important thing is, in 1975 at IIASA, talks about climate change starts to be serious. It is and it's really the key point I wanted to make today. I think to understand the way the climate problem has been framed as something which has to be answered by an energy transition, which is one particular way of framing the question, the climate problem. It's because it is the same institution that were in charge of the energy crisis of the 70s that were in charge thereafter of the climate issue. It's the same economists. They were energy economists that studied the problem of oil scarcity and then studied the problem of climate change. There is one particular character, and I will end up here working at the IIASA at that time, and it is William Nordhaus, that most of you, I guess, know of. What is not that well known is that William Nordhaus is sharing the same future as the atomic scientist. If you read his 1973 article, The Allocation of Energy Resources, a very important article to understand the future of the career of William Nordhaus. It is an article which explained that, in the future, there will be the breeder reactor. This is really the key technology. I haven't detailed that, but it's not the fission, nuclear fission, which is interested for them, these kind of people. It's a breeder reactor, a specific kind of nuclear reactor, which has much greater efficiency. So if you make the assumption, which was really common at the time, that you would have breeder reactor around the year 2000, it makes no sense to try to limit your consumption of oil. Why should you restrain your consumption of oil if in 30-year time you will have this unlimited source of cheap electricity and energy? So it's an interesting, this article is interesting because it's really an application of neoclassical economics of how to maximize the net value of an exhaustible resource. And basically it says that because there will be a technological solution to fossil energy scarcity, we should not limit economic growth. The interesting thing is, 2 years later, he works at IIASA, and in his article, he said that this is really Cesare Malchetti who introduced him with the issue of climate change. And he works really personally with Cesare Malchetti, and he writes his first article, Can We Control Carbon Dioxide? And in this article, you got the first element of the economic model of climate change, for which he will have the Nobel Prize in 2018. And basically, it's the same reasoning as the 73 article. he has exactly the same kind of reasoning. He applies to the climate the same mathematical reasoning of how to maximize not an exhaustible resource, such as oil or coal, but how to maximize the resource of climate, which is for him at that point is you should not double the quantity of CO2 in the atmosphere. So what is the path which maximizes the GDP given this limit of not overpassing the doubling of CO2 in the atmosphere? And he's not the only one, having the same intellectual context. Alan Mann, who is also an extremely important writer in the first IPCC report, doing exactly the same thing as William Nordhaus. He has the same reasoning. I mean, you should wait for the breeder. That's the title of his article of 74. I mean, the key thing for the energy crisis and for the climate change is to wait for the breeder reactor, right? The first report of the IASA in 1982 of the Energy Group, you've got mentions of climate change already. What is interesting is for them, basically, you should not try to limit energy consumption. There is coal, there is abundant coal, so it's not really the prime of scarcity. And the key thing is, in the future, the transition will be easier. That's really also the key argument of Nordhaus. In the future, it's better to wait, in a way, in front of the climate change issue. In the future, we'll have a larger economy, we'll have better technologies, and we'll have the breeder reactor, which is called the backstop technology in 73 and in 75. Interestingly enough, the same vocabulary, the backstop technology, that William Nordhaus used the same word. So in the future, the transition will be much easier, right? And in 1979, and I will conclude with that, in 1979, at the First World Climate Conference, Robert Wright, a meteorologist, said, we have to think climate as a resource. And it's because he's clearly influenced by this first generation of economists of climate change, which were also economists of energy during the energy crisis, that have applied the same kind of reasoning. And I think we should not underestimate the importance of the 70s in the way the climate issue has been framed. I mean, even today, like the actual IPCC president, Oezung Lee, was an Exxon economist in the 1970s working on the problem of the energy crisis and how to deal with the rising price of oil. There is a very strong continuity of institutions. At the Academy of Science in the US, you've got an important report called Energy in Transition, which is published in 1980. And the same group dealing with modeling is in charge of the 1983 report, Changing Climate. And it's repeated in all the other countries. In France, you got the same, the CRED, which is created in 1974, if I'm correct, or 77, which deals with energy crisis. And then they will be the leader on climate change. In India, the Tata Energy Research Institute, which is created in the 70s, which will become the leader on climate change. So there is really a strong institutional, intellectual continuity between the 70s and of the energy crisis and in the 80s and the climate change. The last thing I want to do, two last points. William Nordhaus and all sorts of endogenous growth economists, such as Paul Romer, they were very proud of their refutation of the Global Forum report. And they were right. Technology do solve resource scarcity in a beautiful way for a long period of time. But they were deeply wrong in thinking that their refutation of the Global Forum report could be applied in the same way, in a way, to the issue of climate change, which is radically different. And I really want to emphasize that this is a kind of intellectual scandal and political scandal. The fact that this futurology of the energy transition, which was invented by nuclear scientists in the 60s and 70s, was applied to climate change, it's not normal. It's something that should not have happened. Why? Because for atomic scientists, the energy transition will be something very progressive. It will be dictated by resource scarcity, by the increasing of prices of the fossil fuels. And it was limited to energy production, and it was concerning mainly the rich countries, right? And for instance, William Nordhaus, in his 1973 article, he says, the end of the transition will be around 2100, 2150, something like that, in a very far away future for Cesare Malchetti, the transition will take a lot of time. It's talking about the 22nd century, right? And we have used the same kind of futurology as if we could, entirely shift all sorts of carbon usage in a few decades on a global scale, and including also agriculture and material production of cement, production of steel, production of nitrogen fertilizers. All that could be shifted in a few decades. It's really, I think, a huge step which was taken at the turn of the late 70s and early 80s. I have dug into the archives of the US administration at the Bush-father period. At that time, it's very clear that this idea of energy transition is a negotiation point, talking point. We're not going to fix targets in emissions. We're not going to compensate poor countries for the damages. We're going to help them make an energy transition. But it's just language. It's really about diplomacy. But it was really taken seriously, and far too seriously, I think, by many experts on climate change, and especially by the Group 3 of the IPCC, which is extremely, which has, I think, a very, debatable role in the framing of the climate problem. And I will stop here, just saying that for me, the energy transition is really projecting a false history on a future which remains extremely, not very clear in a way. Thank you.
We continue with Julia Nordblatt. She's joining us from Uppsala University, where she is an associate professor at the Department of History of Science and Ideas. And she's especially interested in the intellectual and political history of the current ecological crisis, particularly with regard to its temporal aspects. She's currently working on two projects. One is a political history of the concept of biodiversity, and the other is a history of ecological economics as political thought in the late 20th century. And you can already see why these three speakers or 4 or 5 speakers and topics resonate with each other so well. I also want to mention a few of her publications. That is one of it is the 2021 article on the difference between Anthropocene and climate change temporalities, published in Critical Inquiry. She has co-edited a special issue of Contemporary European History in 2022 with the title European Histories of the Economic and Environmental. And she is also the author of a 2017 article with the title Time for Politics, How a Conceptual History of Forests Can Help Us Politicize the Long Term, in the European Journal of Social Theory. Today, she's focusing on her biodiversity project with a talk on nature as a resource or habitability system, the struggle over biodiversity and ecosystem services, 1986 to 1997. I'm very much looking forward to this, Julia.
Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone in the room and to my co-panelists and everyone on Zoom. Okay, so this paper traces the emergence of the conceptual nexus of biodiversity and ecosystem services in the public arena from the mid-1980s to the mid-1990s. Okay, so my argument is that this conceptual nexus can be seen as a locus for two different and in some sense even diametrically opposed environmental concepts. Many have argued already that biodiversity and ecosystem services are part of a concept of the environment in line with the rise of liberal paradigm in environmentalism in the late 1980s, and especially sustainable development as the international framework for environmental protection. And there is indeed a lot that speaks for that interpretation. Both biodiversity and ecosystem services were used in ways that framed nature as a resource, something that could be submitted to economic valuation. But others argued against that view. Biodiverse nature could not, they argued, be conceptualized in this way, because its main function for humans was not as a supplier of discrete resources or services, but in that it constituted the systems that provide an habitable planet. So ecosystems provide humanity with things like clean water, the kind of atmosphere that we can breathe, soil maintenance, pollination, etc. In short, nature not as a bunch of resources, but as a kind of world maker, at once biochemical and planetary in scale. As such, it could not, these critics argued, be submitted to economic valuation, since it was the very precondition for any economy or any value system. So on the one hand, we have the liberal conception of nature as a resource, as has been argued in different versions by different scholars that I have put on the slide there. So, for example, Jessica Dempsey, Megan Raby, Christophe Bonneuil, Spash and Ash, and many others. And on the other hand, there is a different idea of nature in this conceptual nexus, and I call that tentatively environment as life support system. And it should, I argue, be understood as belonging to a different framing of the environment, and part of an emerging concept of the planetary and planetary habitability as described by Dipesh Chakrabarty in his 2021 book. And I will not go into that here, but I will just say it. So whereas the first conception has been much discussed, the liberal one, nature as resource, from historicizing and critical perspectives, the latter has not been fully delineated, distinctly named and properly understood. And I will therefore focus on that idea here. And one of the troubles with that conception of concept of the environment is that it has not had a name, or at least not one consistent name. So it has often been conveyed through images and metaphors. Biodiversity and ecosystem services are partly overlapping but distinct terms for nature. And the trouble here is that they have not been used in a clear-cut way that maps onto the two distinct ideas of the environment, the environment as resource and environment as life support. So that is why I talk about a conceptual nexus that is the locus of two different environmental ideas. So there is a kind of mess here, a conceptual mess, and my argument is that there are two distinct ideas in there, so bear with me. For the sake of the argument, I will also present a simplified version here of the history of these two concepts, biodiversity and ecosystem services. And in that simplified version, biodiversity was launched first in 1986, to be precise, and ecosystem services had a breakthrough moment in 1997. The biodiversity and ecosystem services discussions recurrently spurred heated debates about whether economic models could and should be used to conceptualize, communicate, and govern biodiverse nature. And this kind of discussion did not begin with the breakthrough of the term ecosystem services in the mid-1990s, but started already with the launch of the biodiversity concept in the 1980s. And it was in these discussions that the nature as life support concept was articulated, importantly, as a critique of the kind of liberal nature as resource concept. So nature as life support was articulated very much in opposition to these economized conceptions of nature. Let's see how I'm doing there. So the concept of biodiversity was invented by a group of US-American biologists in the 1980s in an effort to sound the alarm on accelerating species extinction. And the breakthrough of the concept occurred in tandem with the emergence of conservation biology, a kind of multidisciplinary field that sought to address the problem of human damage to the natural world, and especially in the form of tropical deforestation. The 1986 National Forum on Biodiversity in Washington, D.C. in September in 1986 was a conference that was organized especially to popularize this issue and to raise awareness and also raise funds for this new research. And it also became, I argue, a critical venue for articulating and discussing this environmental concept of nature as life support, and especially its relationship to economics and economic valuation. And one of the panels at the forum that stood out to contemporary observers was called The Value of Biodiversity. And we can see on the next slide the lineup for that panel. Thanks. It was convened by the resource economist Michael Hahnemann and gathered biologists, philosophers, and economists. And this panel put on display a range of views, from a detailed discussion of what the discipline of economics had to offer the cause of preserving biodiversity on the one hand, to a severe critique of economics as a prime expression of a destructive and morally corrupt culture. And it was in the critique of biodiversity as resource that the idea of nature as life support was articulated. And this view was perhaps most clearly articulated by the philosopher Brian Norton in his paper. And I have a somewhat lengthy quote from this from his speech here. So in this talk, he articulated that biodiversity constituted the fundamental life support function for humans on Earth, and as such, it was structurally incompatible with economic valuation. And he focused on what he portrayed as the fundamental problems with economic valuations of nature. Economics was an inappropriate language in the context of the natural world, because it depended on isolation of units like species in what was really an indivisible whole, an intricate system of interdependencies between species. So he illustrated this, or he illustrated the endeavor of economic valuation of biodiversity by an analogy. And he says that, so here's the analogy. I have been in a terrible accident and I wake up at a hospital bed on a life support system. And the hospital is short on funds, and the hospital administrators are having a meeting at my bedside. They say they have examined all the other methods to raise the necessary money, and they are proposing to sell a few spare parts for my life support system at a yard sale. And furthermore, Norton argues that submitting biodiverse nature to economic valuation was something of a category error, since biodiversity was the very precondition of all values. And he said, quote, "The value of biodiversity is the value of everything there is. It is the summed value of all the GNPs of all countries from now until the end of the world." End of quote. Let's see. So on the next slide, you see a familiar face, I think. Another proponent of the environmentalist life support was Paul Ehrlich, and he is now famous and perhaps also a bit infamous for popularizing neo-Malthusian environmentalism in the 1960s and 70s. But he also, I argue, developed the conception of nature as life support at this biodiversity forum in 1986, and also in his earlier publications. But he referred to this as ecosystem services. So by ecosystem services, Ehrlich meant such functions as the maintenance of the quality of the atmosphere, control and amelioration of climate, generation and maintenance of soils, etc. And exactly as with Norton's ICU machine, Ehrlich used a lot of metaphors and sort of analogies, because this environmental concept did not have a proper term attached to it. So Ehrlich likened humanity's relationship to the biosphere to someone plucking parts at random from an aircraft just before takeoff, while assuring that there was no reason to worry. So Ehrlich is an example of how ecosystem services, how that term was used in the 1980s, namely as a word for the planetary life support system that was made up of the biosphere. And this use of the term was actually the dominating one until 1997. And in that year, 2 publications appeared that changed the course of the concept of ecosystem services. It was now no longer a term used to convey the more or less uneconomizable life support function of nature on a planetary scale. Instead, it became the opposite, the term associated with the project of, so to speak, putting a price tag on nature. So in 1997, the term ecosystem services was flipped to its opposite. And the first publication that contributed to this was Gretchen Daly's edited volume Nature Services, and I will not discuss that one here. But the second one was written by the economist Robert Costanza and a large number of co-authors, and it appeared in Nature. And the title of the piece was The Value of the World's Ecosystem Services and Natural Capital. And this piece advanced the somewhat spectacular argument that the monetary value of the entire biosphere amounted to $33 trillion per year. And that can be compared with the then global GDP per annum of around 18 trillion. So the authors in this article, they recognized, at least paid lip service to, the idea that the world's ecosystems made up the fundamental condition of existence for any economy, but they still maintained the usefulness of calculating the monetary value of the services provided by nature. So the article can indeed be seen as an attempt to submit the entire planetary habitability system to economic valuation. And the Costanza article sparked attention also in the general media as well as among academics. And whereas most commentators were actually rather positive, at least to the stated purpose of creating more awareness and discussion about human dependence on ecosystems, many critical points were also raised. And a core theme in the critique was that nature's planetary life support function was inherently unfit for economic valuation approaches. So again, there is in this critique of this article an articulation of the idea of the environment as planetary life support. And one argument that appeared several times was to portray this whole endeavor as absurd, and again, through images. So, for example, David Ehrenfeld, a biologist, commented in the New York Times, quote, "I am afraid I don't see much hope for a civilization so stupid that it demands a quantitative estimate of the value of its own umbilical cord," end of quote. Or, as in the philosopher William Rees's response, quote, "The relevant question now becomes, how should a parasite value its host?" End of quote. Or in Richard Norgaard and his co-author's question, quote, "Now that we know the exchange value of the earth, we wonder with whom we might exchange it and what we might be able to do with the money, sans earth," end of quote. So you can see here again that this idea, this concept of the environment is conveyed through these striking images rather than through one concise term. So the idea of life support was also present in the more technical critique of the methodology that Costanza and his co-authors had used in their valuation exercise. Much of this discussion centered on the concept of marginal value. So in the reception of the Nature article, a recurring critique was, or recurring issue was whether the authors had in effect conducted marginal analysis as they claimed, but also the more principled question of whether marginal analysis was appropriate for the questions the article claimed to answer. And I argue, I will not provide you with the evidence now because there is no time, but I argue that this issue of marginal versus total value maps onto the distinction between nature as resource and nature as a kind of precondition for all resources. So the environmental concept of nature as life support was present also in the more technical and methodological discussion of this article. So in short, in the reception of this article, Costanza's article, the idea of planetary habitability, nature as life support, played a central role, if under different names and images. So instead of a neat conclusion, I will end by showing a preliminary summary of some of the characteristics of this concept of the environment as life support. So one characteristic is that it has not been consistently named. It has instead been conveyed largely through images. So rivet popping, ICU machine, the parasite's host, umbilical cord, etc. This concept of nature has sister concepts, but I think that it is different. It is a distinct concept, and I do not go into that here, but I want to mention it. So, for example, Gaia is a kind of related concept, but I think there are important differences. It is anti-economic. Its proponents stress again and again that this is a concept of planetary nature that resists economic models and economic valuation. And it fits within the emerging category of the planetary and planetary habitability as described by Dipesh Chakrabarti. Thank you. I will end there.
Very much, Julia. And I'm going to rush to our commentator because of the time. She's already familiar to many of us here in the room, since we have the pleasure to have her here at Leipzig University. Daniela Ross is a junior assistant professor in the Global and European Studies Institute, and she's a historical sociologist interested in the relationship between society and nature in a global perspective, focusing on the history of the energy economy, the decarbonization of the electric grid, the theory and practice of Soviet energy planning, and ecological thought. And she has a forthcoming book entitled Working Nature, Steam, Power, and the Failure of the Energy Economy. And I want to mention two of her articles, one from 2021, Deciphering Economic Futures, Electricity, Calculation, and the Power Economy, 1880 to 1930 in Centauros, and an article in Journal for Global History from 2020, Speaking for the World Power Economy, Electricity, Energo-Materialist Economics, and the World Energy Council. Thanks for agreeing to comment.
Sure. I'm just assuming that you can hear me online. Perfect. So let me start by saying that I'm really honored to give a comment on three such wonderful papers that I also, was able to read before. So I've not written down that comment just right now. And I'll be doing my best to, live up to that task in only 10 minutes or so. I think when Antje and Nina started putting together the panel, I'm sure you wouldn't have imagined that the paper in the end fit together so nicely.
It was all planned, of course.
So it seems to me that we could relate Julia's search for the concepts of nature underlying the paradigms of ecosystem service and biodiversity to Carl's and Frederick's types of scarcity, so that what Julia calls on nature as a life support system would become visible as an articulation of planetary scarcity, for instance. And maybe the substitution modeling Jean-Baptiste described is exactly what the neoclassical scarcity is about. And that would also maybe be what Julia calls the economic valuation of nature. So I think in a way we could, just collapse all papers into undifferentiated unity and then end the discussion. But of course, I would like to draw out a couple of questions for each of you. And most of it will be, because the panel is about epistemic orders and then linked to global orders, and most of you are intellectual historians, so I'm going to push you a little on how they link to the more structural processes going on.
So the power of the synthesis provided by Carl and Frederick, I think, is already apparent in how well it linked together the papers that have very different objects. So, energy transitions and biodiversity kind of become readable through the lens of the scarcity concept. And I'm sure the shift to from a neoclassical to planetary scarcity really resonates with everybody working in the field and working with the kind of materials and institutions, over the last 100 years or so. We've come across kind of materials where these ideas of scarcity are apparent. So as I understand it, scarcity here is seen as or perhaps the central concept through which societies reflect their economic relation to nature. And I wonder whether you could say a bit more about how you understand this relation between nature, scarcity, and the economy, and why scarcity is so important. You could also talk about abundance or something else. So is scarcity a natural condition that appears differently at different points in time? Or is it rather a social reflection on, nature's resistance that's, is different at different points in time? And then also, is it an economic theory, or is it more of a culture? Because you look at very different materials where these kind of ideas come up, and how important is the form it takes for whether it is effective and how it is really effective in changing economic practice in the end. And related to this is that you refer to capitalism several times in the book, and it's also in the subtitle. So it's a history from the origins of capitalism, which already hints at scarcity being a relation to nature that might be specific to capitalism. I don't know. And you do link conceptions of scarcity also to stages or different forms of capitalist development. So neoclassical scarcity roughly overlaps with, high capitalism, and the unease with late capitalism then kind of spawns the first seeds of planetary thinking. At least that's how I read the chapters in the book. And I wanted to push you a little on how precisely you imagine the relation between conceptions of scarcity and capitalism. Because we might be tempted to use the old base superstructure model for the neoclassical scarcity, but for planetary scarcity, it is clearly different. It seems to be something that kind of resists or should work against economic exploitation, right? But I wondered whether it is different in reality, and whether it is really a scarcity that can resist being drawn into capitalist valuation, or whether, couldn't planetary scarcity just open up a new round of enclosures where forests are now valorized in a double way? They're like still resources, but then they're also a carbon sink, and people have to pay for what used to be free, which is emission of carbon dioxide. So would like to hear your thoughts on that. This brings me to the second paper, Jean-Baptiste's paper on the atomic roots of the concept of energy transition. And this work is probably closest to my own, so it's really hard to curb my desire to ask more. I really liked how you turn the concept of energy transition against itself. So how, promoting this kind of transition undermines a meaningful transition, as it lulls everyone into already, being part of a smooth movement that starts at one state and then goes over into another, like automatically almost. And I was also convinced by your argument that energy transitions have their roots in the anticipation of the future. I wondered, though, throughout the text, what we would gain if we did not follow the word energy transition, but more, in a Koselleckian way of a conceptual history, if we would more follow the semantic of the concept, not necessarily the word, and the changes that it refers to. So what I mean by this is, we could also understand the concept of the energy transition as a longer discourse on the remaking of the energy economy. And if we do that, we could see the electrification projects of the 1920s also as a kind of an energy transition. And I wondered why you not do it, or I'm also not saying it's the same. I think there's clear differences, but there's also some continuation. And I would think it's interesting to see, because it's a time when economic history really was reformulated in energetic terms, when that kind of thinking, the stage of coal, the stage of electricity, and so on comes up. And also, I would say it implies a substitution, not of primary energy, but of secondary energy. And I don't know, does that matter? How do you think about it? Another point that resonated with my own work was your insistence on that energy sources are symbiotic and not, or they are as much in competition as they are in symbiosis. And I wanted to push you a bit to make this, which is a rather general statement, more precise. So I think there are different ways to explain the coexistence of old and new form of energies that would not necessarily be symbiotic, or not sure whether you could call them, like, for instance, you could just think it's something like a combined but unequal development, right? That would not, well, in the sense of, the new comes up and it's somewhere else, it produces more of the old, or ways like this to think about it, but which would not necessarily be symbiotic. Or you could also just say, it's a mere increase in material throughput that affects just everything. So your example with mining, for instance, if you just say it's just, production is growing in general, so of course there will be more production of everything. So, but this is not necessarily a symbiotic relationship between coal and wood, for instance. But there are clearly symbiotic relationships, and I think that would always be the case if one form of energy makes the other more profitable. So, for instance, gas as a byproduct of coal, or water and thermal power in interconnected grids. So I'm just wondering whether you have like a more differentiated understanding of different types of when energies make each other possible. Okay, so let's turn to the third presentation. Julia's paper is, in my view, a really important contribution to the panel, as it gives a bit of a closer account of the kind of epistemic practices that the economic approach to nature involves. And she reminds us of a common past of the ecosystem services and the biodiversity paradigm, where they were still seen as opposing an economic approach to nature. And as I understand, the economic approach treats nature as a bunch of isolated resources. And because they exist as single resource, they can be individually valued and inserted as quantities in economic models and calculations. And both of these paradigms used to relate to another concept of nature, which is nature as habitability or a life support system. And this would see nature as the entirety of systems that provide a habitable planet. And as such, nature is the precondition of any economy or value system and cannot be valued itself. So I'm interested here, what you think are the reasons that the ecosystem services paradigm was flipped, as you express it. So what's the role of the Costanza article in the broader context of the time? And would you rather say it's something like a hijacking of a concept, or is it a failed attempt to generate attention for the habitability question by communicating it in the language that counts, in a monetary language? And then maybe to go a bit further, why did the concept of nature as habitability fail, and what should we learn from its failure? Especially if we keep talking about these nice ways to think about nature, but they never really happen. So one way to try to understand this failure would be to search for traces of the economic in the nature as habitability. And I think I was reading here more less towards the Gaia concept, but more towards where you were coming from, like the biodiversity idea. So certainly both share a natural scientific approach to nature, and the identification of systems implies the analytic isolation of components. So I'm not really sure whether, in the scientific work, the biodiversity is really so different from, counting ecosystem services or so. And it just seems to me that it certainly doesn't really resist economization by itself.
And that appears.
I recently read a Financial Times article. on how microbes are now used in farming to increase the amount of carbon the soil can store. And it just struck me how the one scientific paradigm that really showed how entangled our life is with like tiny little other creatures that we hadn't never thought about. And that was so important for the thinking about nature and society and the humanities and the social sciences is now being incorporated in business as usual. So I just wondered, is this now, can we call this a more modest relation to nature now? Maybe a relation that mimics processes that go on? Or is it a technology of healing and repair, as in Frederick's and Carl's paper? Or is it just another resourcification of microbes? So there's much more I would like to say, but I'll end here and open the discussion for everyone.
Yes, thank you very much, Daniela. So maybe we can have a very brief round of answers to the question that she raised, so that we can have time for the pressing questions from the audience.
All right, well, I guess we'll just go in the sequence of the questions then. So I'll try to be very brief. Thank you, Daniela, very much for those questions and for weaving our three papers together in a brilliant way. Very much appreciated that. So why scarcity, and why did we decide to organize our book around that? Well, what we're trying to do is to challenge the way that the economists are thinking about the world and how they're training future generations to think about the relationship between the economy and nature. We see that as a destructive and irresponsible way of looking at the world. And we recognize that there's a need for a paradigm shift. We've been thinking like economists now for about 150 years, and it has generated all kinds of benefits that should not be denied. But if we are to listen to science, we're now at a moment in history where we have to reconsider this. And if people are trained within this idea of scarcity, you're kind of locked into a particular logic that it's really hard to think yourself out of. And certain economists like Dasgupta, for example, is experimenting with different ways of conceiving of the relationship between economy and nature. We applaud that. But in a study that was an accounting exercise that was undertaken a couple of years ago, where the top 5 journals in economics, all the abstracts and titles were scrutinized, and there were something like 32 out of 19,000 articles that mentioned global warming and climate crisis. So economists are still very much thinking within this paradigm, and they're teaching students, more importantly, within this paradigm. So that's why we feel like scarcity is the entry point into economics, and that's where we need to do some rethinking. In terms of what scarcity is, there's of course moments of scarcity. There's moment of dearth. There's moment of shortage. We're not particularly interested in any particular moment in time in which certain resources or things are particularly scarce. We're interested in mindsets. We're interested in zeitgeist, in worldview. How is it that people are conceiving of the nature economy nexus? This is in some ways unique to capitalism. We start our book with the idea of neo-Aristotelian scarcity, which posits a nature that is scant and rugged, and in some ways a kind of a punishment for original sin. It's not something that is dynamic or can grow over time or with science and technology. And they also conceive of society as something that is fixed, hierarchical, and static. So here there's a balance of limitation. We then make an argument that, that in the 17th century with Hart-Libyan thinking, all of a sudden, I'm not going to go into the detail, but all of a sudden it becomes okay to think about nature as a cornucopia. And that has a lot to do with alchemical and scientific thinking. Also, people like Barban and Mandeville make it okay for us to think of the 7 deadly sins as a virtue or something that drives the economy and provides an infinite impetus behind economic growth. Then, we move on and look at challenges to those models, reactions to those models, and we see how this worldview kind of evolves over time. So while we're blaming the economist worldview to a great extent for creating this abundance and this mess, it's not only because of them. They're drawing on ideas that were originated in the 17th century. So the book is very much an effort to kind of grasp zeitgeist and worldviews and to historicize it, to encourage young scholars and in the humanities and social sciences and in the natural sciences to gain the kind of confidence that's required to take on the economists by positing different models. Fredrik.
Thanks so much, Daniela, for this wonderfully rich set of comments. I'll just say very, very briefly, because we're almost out of time, that we are very much in agreement with Julia that we don't have good names yet for the kind of condition and processes we're in the midst of. We take planetary scarcity as a kind of provisional proxy umbrella term for an emergent process in the natural sciences, in earth system science and ecology, and also, very importantly, in culture and politics. So delineating a physical condition of habitability, a life support, or perhaps a planetary boundary. And it's very, very important to notice that phytoplankton here could be seen as a kind of marker of the a kind of boundary, conceptual boundary, perhaps even affective boundary that gives us nature, the life support system in Julia's terms, at its most alien. Phytoplankton are basically vital to us, and yet they have no cultural representation, that there's no politics to it, they have no market value. Perhaps, Daniela, it's possible that they will be enclosed and turned into a resource. Certainly there are ambitions in that direction, but it may also be that they resist this process, and much depends on us. I'll give you just one possible future here. One of my projects that I would like to work on in the next couple of years is the idea of carbon sinks, basically the history of carbon sinks and the politics and ethics of knowing carbon sinks. And the project would move from well-known carbon sinks like the boreal rainforest into the soil, into the wetlands, sphagnum, etc., and then end with phytoplankton in the ocean as the most difficult carbon sink to know and care for. And the whole idea of the project is to tell stories in a pluralistic political manner of the different ways in which we could imagine carbon sinks and caring for carbon sinks and producing new kinds of politics around them.
And then I would have a question to you, Fredrik and Carl. So I will try to be brief as well. First of all, thanks, Daniela. They are very good questions. And actually, I must say I got chapters that answer to your questions. So I'm not going to make a second and a third talk. But first, of course, there is a long idea of energy transition, if you want to go into that. It starts in the late 19th century. It comes from the industrialist discourse. And I have really studied this idea of the age of coal, the age of steam, the age of railways. So I've got an article and a chapter on that. But at the beginning, it's just, industrial promotion literature. They start with journals called the coal age, the age of steam, the gas age, but they are just technical journals. And the strange thing, it is taken seriously by intellectuals, by philosophers, by historians. That's really strange. And of course, the best known example is Lewis Mumford, who is considered as a great historian of technology, but is actually really saying very strange things. And is really, I think, a second-order intellectual. I mean, for instance, he said it's really amazing that we are still using wood in the age of steel. Gosh, well, yeah, of course, the US had never used as much wood as when you write that, and so I mean, really the very strange thing is all this stage theory of energy, of material, of society, they come from very dubious intellectual backgrounds. They come from Malthusian fear of scarcity as well. If you read Jevons, there is this idea that there will be something after coal. But the real experts, they know that the electrical age is rubbish. Very quickly, they know that the amount of electricity that you will get out of water is limited, and that coal will remain central for the production of electricity. So, Lewis Mumford, when he says about the neotechnic age, the age of neotechnics, which will be based on hydroelectricity, is really completely outdated, because there are already serious articles explaining that the whole potential of hydroelectricity in the US is not that big compared to the needs. So, I will stop on this, but you're right. There is an old history of this idea, but the big difference with the story I'm talking later is this is obviously not from serious people. They're not from experts. The real experts, they know that this is rubbish. That's the big difference. It's nowadays the experts are talking the discourse that was rubbish. That's the problem. The second thing, so the second question was about the typology of symbiosis. What the whole book is about, tracing all the sorts of symbiosis between the three main sources of energy: wood, coal, and oil. I would distinguish between symbiosis which takes place upstream in the production, when energy is produced. So this is indeed the timber to produce coal, but also the steel to produce oil. This is big, but not that big. What really matters is the symbiosis that takes place on the consumption side. It's where for instance, railways consume much more wood, timber, compared to coal mines, to put it simply, or packaging consume more wood than coal mine, depending on the countries. Britain is a bit different. But so really the big story of energy symbiosis is in the realm of consumption, not in the realm of production. This is a key aspect, because nowadays there are stupid criticism of renewable energies. Yes, renewable energies are in symbiosis with coal and oil, of course, because you need fossil fuels to produce the steel, to produce the windmills and so on and so forth, of course. But it is limited compared to all the energy that you will need to produce the electric car. It's another order of magnitude. So at one point, Frederick said we should not be technophobe. No, of course we shouldn't be technophobe, but we should distinguish. Some technologies we have to defend them, but other technologies need to be criticized. And probably electric cars are in the wrong side of the history of technology. Yes. So it's not a complete answer to the typology that you could do, but really this idea that the important thing is on the consumption side and not in the production side, I think is a important political point. I have a question to both of you. I perfectly sympathize with your idea of a critique of neoclassical economics and its relationship with environmental, the framing of environmental questions, indeed. At the same time, if you take the case of William Nordhaus, I've talked about the first William Nordhaus, which was not that bad. Then there is the William Nordhaus of the 1990s, which is even worse, because then, the first William Nordhaus reflects with a given carbon budget, and he says, what are the trajectory that optimize the GDP given this carbon budget? But then the second William Nordhaus just got rid of the carbon budget. And put inside the economic theory the optimal temperature, and with a damage function, and he reaches the conclusion that 3.5 degrees Celsius is the optimal temperature. So scarcity could be a very, very important concept to defend, because nowadays it seems that the 2 degrees target is going to evaporate, of course, in a few decades. The next point will be, okay, what is the next target? So, if you want to defend the 2 degree target, you have to have an idea of scarcity, artificial scarcity. I agree. Scarcity that we have to impose ourselves. But scarcity is an important concept, I think, for nowadays.
I would like to give Julia the chance to offer her comment on Daniela's questions.
Okay. Thank you so much, Daniela. These are really good points, and I'm not sure I can give a good answer to all of them now, but I will definitely, take them with me. But I will just say briefly that you're very right that these two concepts were very intertwined, and they rely on the same science. But I think it's useful for us to echo Fredrik also, that it's useful for us now to try and articulate them and isolate them, because maybe that can help us move forward in understanding our problem. And I think one of the problems here is one of demarcation between the two, because the two concepts of the environment are both have their place. They're both viable in a sense, but the problem is that they rely on the same biosphere. So the problem is one of, demarcating one from the other. So for the life support concept, it has to handle somehow or give an account of how to handle that parts of nature will be harvested or used in different ways. So how can that be articulated together with this life support idea? And for the resource concept of nature, they have to come up with an answer to the problem that is that in the aggregate, all these resources are that they handle in isolation, that in the aggregate, they do constitute the kind of umbilical cord for humanity as a whole. So, there are problems with both positions, and I think that is a kind of useful question to ask.
Thank you. We can add a few more minutes, 5 to 10 minutes, for questions from the audience.
Thank you so much for this nice panel and for putting it together. I really learned a lot. I have a short question to Fredrik and Carl, and I was really struck by this age of repair that you imagined or that you outlined towards the end of the book, when you were mentioning the slowing down of the great acceleration in technical and cultural terms, and why you gave some examples about these technical terms. I was wondering about the cultural terms and what you actually mean by this. Perhaps you can give some examples specifically, because it entails also the ethic of responsibility, the kind of negotiations culturally. When does responsibility start on an individual level? When is it? When does the state responsibility start? For instance, what kind of moral rules are actually come into play? And culturally, we have to learn to live with these planetary boundaries and scarcity. So perhaps you can briefly just comment and give some examples or ideas what you mean with this cultural terms. Thank you.
Very briefly. We agree with Dipesh Chakraborty that although the problem of the Earth system has to be treated as a singular problem, our responses are likely to be marked by political and cultural difference. So we don't assume, for example, that a socialist revolution will solve this problem for us, and at least not in the near future. Whatever happens has to be worked out within the plurality of humanity. And that means many different political paths and cultural representations of the unity of the Earth system, of the life support system, and how to center human life around that problem. Phytoplankton, again, is such an interesting limit condition on that kind of representation, right? How on earth could we make phytoplankton into a well-known, sort of intimately known object of human practice? I don't have a good answer to that. I hope to explore it in my next book. But it's obvious that within politics in the present moment, there are interesting new directions to take, including, of course, degrowth, centering economies on communal conviviality. Jean-Baptiste was mentioning the problem of electric cars and kind of individual approach to sustainability. But all of this, again, has to be worked out. I think we shouldn't assume that there will ever be unity on this. It has to be worked out locally. And that's, of course, the desperate problem is that democracy takes time and we're running out of time. Sorry, I don't have anything more uplifting.
Can I just add to that, Frederick, what we provide examples of in the book are all these different ways where people have thought very differently and therefore related very differently to the economy and to nature. So when we talk about the Romantics, for example, we talk about a very different conceptualization of humanity's role in the economy. When we talk about, Fourier and the socialists, it's a very different idea of pleasure and a different notion of what drives people. When we talk about the Aristotelian, we talk about religious constraints and norms and laws that are actually preventing people from unleashing their desires on an unlimited scale. And this connects to the question that was asked previously. Scarcity is of course important, but it's how we think about it. And when we think about planetary scarcity, it's exactly the real scarcity of things and natural resources that we're concerned about, whereas the economists are using ideas of infinite substitutability, fungibility, and insatiability, and that's not the right way to structure the thinking about the kind of culture that we need in order to have a chance to survive on the planet.
Thanks very much. It can be a short question in time, but it's maybe a big question, which is that I was surprised to not hear more about empire and colonialism, given that I guess that in the sort of Anthropocene origin stories, there's this is often seen to start with the European colonization of the Americas potentially, and in that sense, like colonialism caused climate change is a kind of broad argument some people put forward. And then in the 70s, in the 1970s, which 80s perhaps, that we heard about a lot in the papers, there's this kind of the fear in the Western world of losing its kind of grip on the rest of the world, and where the empire is a bigger factor in this intellectual history than we might have heard in those papers, or not?
I think the role of empire in the Anthropocene is overblown. It's not that important. I mean, coal, steel, wood was really abundantly available in Europe, and the most important economic exchange for Britain at that time actually was in Europe by far. Even if you look at the case of Britain, which is of course particularly important in terms of imperial power, the trade with Argentina is larger than the trade with India, for instance, in the late 19th century. So and of course the trade with the United States or the trade with France is much more important. For the case of France, Belgium is far more important than Algeria, in economic terms. So there is really, I think, a too strong emphasis on this dimension. And for the case of energy transition, it is, there is a real cynicism in the case of the US, which I worked upon. Basically, very quickly, as soon as 1978, they say that the key aspect is adaptation. That's really the real thing that matters, because global climate change is unavoidable. They have some good energy modeling showing that you could put 300% tax on coal, it wouldn't change that much. It would just delay the global warming a few decades, but nothing more. So basically, the rest of the world is quite absent from their reasoning. It's very impressive. And, the US is a very large territory, so they can adapt. They can shift the place of agriculture. They have a really positive discourse on themselves and on their capacity to adapt. And the rest of the world is not that important.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have to stop here because the room has to be prepared for the next session that starts in 15 minutes. Thanks to all of the panelists, and sorry again for the technical issues. Thanks for your patience. Thanks for the questions. And fortunately, there is coffee and cake. We meet in 15 minutes for the ReCentGlobe General Assembly for the members of the ReCentGlobe, and the next session will start at 6:45 with the keynote. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks again. Bye now.